Welcome to today's deep dive. So I want you to picture a scenario for a second. You're sitting in one of those fluorescent lit corporate meeting rooms, or, maybe you're just staring at a grid of faces on a video call.
Right, the classic Zoom grid.
Yeah, exactly. And the CEO clears their throat, looks at the camera, and says something like, to optimize our talent footprint and ensure future agility, we'll be initiating a reduction in force. And you probably just nod along, maybe jot it down, because, the phrasing sounds so clean.
It does. It's so clinical.
Right, so clinical and professional, almost inevitable.
Yeah, it comes across like a weather event, like a storm or some force of nature that just happens to roll through the office and is just completely out of anyone's control.
Exactly. So today, we're going behind that sanitized boardroom language. We are pulling from this incredible piece of research by Dr. Jonathan H. Westover, and it's called The Hidden Costs of Reduction in Force. Our mission for this deep dive is to really decode this corporate jargon, strip away all the business school speak, and look at the massive, often shocking gap between what leaders say during a downsizing and the actual lived reality on the ground.
And that gap is just profoundly important because we aren't just debating semantics here. How an organization talks about cutting jobs has these massive implications for human health, for organizational survival, and really the very fabric of trust in the workplace.
Yeah, it really does.
So we're going to look closely at the data to see what actually happens to a company's bottom line and its people when leaders rely on these linguistic shields.
Okay, let's unpack this because we really have to start with the language itself, right? How a company talks about a layoff reveals a lot about how decision makers are, justifying it to themselves. Westover's research points out this fascinating concept of semantic distance. What is that actually doing in the room when a leader says they're right-sizing instead of just saying, they're firing people?
So semantic distance is essentially the psychological breathing room that euphemisms create. It puts this heavy padded barrier between the person making a difficult decision and the uncomfortable reality of that decision.
Like a buffer.
Exactly, a buffer. And in the context of workforce reductions, researchers identify three main linguistic strategies at play here. First, you have nominalization.
Which means like taking an active verb and turning it into a passive noun, right?
That is the textbook definition.
Yeah.
So instead of saying, we are firing our staff, which points directly to an agent taking a deliberate action, they say, a reduction is occurring.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, right. It makes the action sound entirely passive, like no human being is actually pulling the trigger. It's just happening.
Like the weather event you mentioned earlier.
Exactly. Now, the second strategy is extraction. This is where you stop talking about people or employees or colleagues, and you start talking about FTEs.
Full-time equivalents.
Right, or headcount. You take human beings with mortgages and families, and you just turn them into mechanical components. And then the third linguistic strategy is technical rational framing.
Technical rational framing. What does that look like?
This is where a deeply social and ethical crisis is reframed as nothing more than a simple math problem to be solved on a spreadsheet.
Man, it's slightly chilling when you break it down into those categories. It makes you wonder why leaders default to this. Like, are they naturally cold-hearted, or is something else driving this vocabulary?
Well, the research outlines four primary drivers for this language, and it actually rarely stems from malice. The first driver is simply psychological comfort, which is sometimes called moral disengagement.
So they're protecting themselves.
Right. Terminating someone's livelihood causes profound cognitive dissonance for a manager. Calling it a position elimination just makes that emotional weight bearable. The second reason is legal risk management.
Ah, the lawyers.
Exactly. HR and corporate legal departments love terms like reduction in force because they emphasize business necessity over individual performance. That framing provides a significant layer of legal cover against, say, wrongful termination lawsuits.
That makes sense. And I imagine the third and fourth reasons probably have to do with outward appearances, right? Managing impressions for stakeholders, maybe?
You hit the nail on the head. You want the investors and the market to think you're making a brilliant strategic realignment rather than admitting the company might be failing.
Yeah, that's a huge difference in optics.
And plus, there's an element of institutional mimicry. Every other company is using these words, so it just becomes the accepted water you swim in.
What's really crazy about all of this is, well, actually, what do you think the biggest fallout from this is?
What's fascinating here is the credibility gap this inevitably creates. While the executive feels protected and legally secure by calling it a workforce optimization, the employee on the receiving end hears financial hardship, They hear a massive disruption to their identity and their family's stability.
Right. The language completely fails to match the lived reality.
Exactly. And when that disconnect happens, trust is instantly destroyed. Both the people who are leaving and the people who are staying, they realize that leadership is either completely out of touch with reality or actively trying to minimize their pain.
It makes me think of like an analogy. Think about it like a doctor walking into an emergency room, right? They look at a patient with a bone sticking out of their leg and they clinically diagnose it as a skeletal discontinuity.
Oh, that's a perfect way to put it.
Right. I mean, it might make the doctor feel highly analytical and entirely in control of the situation, but it completely ignores the patient who is literally screaming in pain. It solves the doctor's discomfort while doing absolutely nothing for the person who's actually suffering.
That is a highly accurate way to visualize the dynamic. And the tragedy of this situation is that this linguistic distancing actually sets the stage for a massive strategic failure.
How so?
Well, if these sanitized terms are meant to protect the decision makers and execute a perfectly smooth transition to a more profitable future, we really have to look at the data to see if that restructuring actually helps the organization in the long run.
Which is the big question, right? The whole promise of a reduction in force is that you trim the excess fat and suddenly you emerge with this sleek, restructured machine that's going to dominate the market. But the data Westover compiles from various studies says something completely different, doesn't it?
The assumption that downsizing automatically leads to better corporate performance is one of the most pervasive myths in modern business. Let's look at the numbers. There's a major foundational study by Cascio that analyzed 537 organizations that announced layoffs.
Wait, 537? That's a massive sample size.
Huge. And he tracked them over time and found that downsizing companies did not systematically outperform stable companies in terms of return on assets or stock performance.
Not at all.
Nope. And another comprehensive study looking at the S&P 500 found that organizations experiencing layoffs actually showed lower subsequent revenue growth and lower profitability compared to their industry peers who maintained workforce stability.
Wait, I have to push back on this because the math feels so counterintuitive to me. Labor is usually the single biggest line item cost for any business, right? If you cut your payroll by 20%, you automatically save that money on day one. How does that simple addition and subtraction fail to make the company more profitable? It seems like an airtight equation.
It only seems simple until you account for the massive hidden costs that just don't show up neatly on a quarterly spreadsheet. When you cut headcount, you aren't just eliminating a salary, you're severing deeply established customer relationships.
Oh, right, the clients leave with the salesperson.
Often, yes. And you're losing institutional knowledge, the unwritten, complex rules of how things actually get done in the building. Then you have the direct, immediate costs of the restructuring itself. Massive severance payouts, hiring out placement services, elevated legal fees. But the single most damaging hidden cost that ruins that simple math is the adverse selection effect.
Adverse selection. How does that work in a layoff? If leadership is choosing who goes, shouldn't they theoretically be keeping all their best people and letting go of the underperformers?
In theory, yes. But in reality, when a company announces layoffs, the environment becomes incredibly unstable and toxic. The best rating employees, your top performers who have the strongest resumes and the most options in the job market, they look around at the chaos and often decide to voluntarily quit.
Wow. So they just leave on their own.
Exactly. They take their talents to a more stable competitor. So the company is left with a severe brain drain. And beyond that, the organization loses its capacity for innovation. A brilliant study by Samaya and Williamson looked at technology firms and found that after layoffs, companies produced significantly fewer patents, and the patents they did produce were of much lower quality.
Live into the why on that patent study for a second. Why would a layoff make the remaining engineers suddenly less inventive? I mean, shouldn't they be working harder?
Because innovation requires taking risks, and taking risks requires psychological safety. If you just watch 20% of your colleagues get walked out the door by security, you're terrified.
Yeah, that makes sense.
You are not going to pitch a wild, unproven idea to your boss. You're going to keep your head down, do exactly what is asked of you, and try not to get noticed. The diverse perspectives and the safety required to take creative leaps are completely destroyed.
And the quality of the actual day-to-day work plummets, too. I was struck by the section detailing Baumol's manufacturing study. It showed that after a layoff, actual product defects increased for up to 2 years.
2 years, yeah.
And even scarier, a separate study in the healthcare sector showed an increase in patient safety incidents after staff reductions. The people left behind are just too overloaded and exhausted to catch the mistakes.
Exactly. The remaining employees are stretched incredibly thin, often doing the work of multiple people. So if the company rarely sees the financial benefits it expects, and productivity actually drops, who is actually paying the true price of these decisions?
The human beings, we have to talk about the human toll here. The data Westover presents is just devastating, both for the people who are displaced and the people who survive the cuts. Let's start with the displaced workers, because we're looking at a massive meta-analysis of over 250,000
It's
individuals.
a staggering amount of data.
Yeah, and this research clearly shows that the psychological trauma of unexpected job loss matches the trauma of going through a divorce or suffering a major illness.
And the physical impacts are equally staggering. We see significantly increased rates of cardiovascular disease among laid-off workers. And there's one statistic in the research that should make every single executive pause before signing off on a staff reduction.
What's that?
Job displacement for workers in their 50s and early 60s elevates their mortality rate, equivalent to aging an extra 1.5 years.
Oh my God.
It is a literal physiological shock to the human system. And economically, it's rarely just a temporary blip between jobs. Displaced workers often face a 10 to 20% wage reduction when they finally do find new work, and that wage penalty can persist for 15 to 20 years.
I need to pause on that mortality statistic for a second. An extra year and a half of aging just from the stress of losing a job late in your career, that gives so much weight to what we were saying earlier about language. Calling that kind of life-altering event a headcount reduction is almost absurd when you realize it's impacting how long someone might actually live.
It really highlights the absurdity of the jargon, yeah.
And it ripples out into their families, too. Divorce rates go up, children's academic performance drops. It's a holistic crisis. But here's where it gets really interesting. The people who actually keep their jobs do not necessarily fare much better. The research outlines this widespread phenomenon called survivor syndrome.
Survivor syndrome represents a profound violation of the implicit psychological contract between an employer and an employee. The survivors experience deep guilt for keeping their jobs while their friends were fired.
Like survivor's guilt in a disaster.
Exactly. They experience intense, lingering anxiety about when the next round of cuts might happen, and their morale just plummets. They are suddenly drowning in what researchers call the personnel equivalent of bloodletting. They're expected to do the work of 3 departed colleagues with absolutely no extra resources or compensation.
It's an incredible irony. The people who supposedly won by keeping their paychecks end up with health outcomes that are just as bad as the people who are fired. The chronic stress of job insecurity, that constant burning fear of, am I next, triggers physical health effects that literally rival the physical effects of actual job loss.
That is the tragic, inevitable reality of treating human beings as variable costs on a spreadsheet. However, economic realities do exist. Companies will inevitably face severe financial pressures or shifts in their markets. The critical question becomes, how can an organization execute a necessary downsizing without destroying its soul and sabotaging its own future?
Let's focus on those solutions because Westover's research outlines some very clear evidence-based methods for transparency and fair process. We need to talk about how to do this better when it's truly unavoidable. Boeing actually provides a fascinating case study in learning this lesson the hard way, don't they?
They really do. Early in a restructuring process, Boeing used standard, sanitized corporate jargon to announce layoffs, and employee trust absolutely plummeted.
Yocker.
Right. But then leadership completely changed tactics. Boeing's senior leaders realized the damage they were causing and started doing direct site visits. They spoke honestly and openly about the human pain of the job eliminations. They completely dropped the euphemisms.
And what happened?
As a result of that direct communication, trust within the organization began to recover. It wasn't that the layoff stopped hurting. I mean, losing a job always hurts. But the radical transparency restored the employees' belief in leadership's integrity.
That brings up the concept of procedural justice, which American Express utilized beautifully during the 2008 financial crisis. Instead of a sudden, opaque culling where people just disappeared on a Friday afternoon, they shared very clear, objective criteria before any cuts were made.
That transparency is key.
Yeah, and they gave individual, detailed explanations to affected employees and even instituted a process where employees could appeal the decision.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the American Express example perfectly illustrates why procedural justice is so paramount. Procedural justice is the psychological concept that how fair a process feels is often more important to human beings than the actual outcome of that process.
That's fascinating.
It is. Even if someone loses their job, if they truly believe the process was logical, unbiased, and respectful, their resentment is drastically reduced. American Express saw much higher perceived justice across the company and a significantly lower turnover rate among their surviving top performers, simply because the process felt fair and visible.
Because the way you treat the departing employees is constantly being watched and judged by the surviving employees. AT&T understood this when they had to undergo a massive transition. They offered incredible support, 6 to 12 months of severance pay, extended health insurance, and paid retraining for emerging roles in the industry. It preserved their employer brand because they put actual financial resources behind their transition support.
Supporting the survivors is equally crucial, and Merck executed this brilliantly after a period of layoffs. They didn't just tell everyone to stop complaining and get back to work.
Which is usually what happens.
Right. Instead, they held extensive listening sessions to let people vent and process the change. But more importantly, they empowered teams to systematically eliminate low-value administrative work. They didn't just ask them to do more with less, they recalibrated the workload so it was actually achievable. Because they gave the remaining employees control over cutting the busy work, Merck recovered their pre-layoff engagement levels in a record 18 months.
So, if I'm a manager listening to this deep dive and I have to go into a room and deliver this terrible news to my team tomorrow, what is the single most important thing I must do in that moment?
The single most important thing you can do is explicitly acknowledge the emotional reality of the moment without hiding behind corporate jargon.
So, no talent footprint optimization.
Exactly. Do not walk in and say, your position has been selected for elimination due to macroeconomic headwinds. Walk in and say, I have incredibly difficult news. We have to let you go. This is painful. I know it is going to deeply impact you and your family, and I'm so sorry. You must validate their humanity. Offer clarity and compassion, completely stripping away the corporate shield.
That is powerful, actionable advice. But, going through all this data makes me wonder, what if we didn't have to get to that room in the first place? We've talked extensively about doing layoffs better, but what if organizations didn't default to layoffs at all?
That is the ultimate alternative path. Companies often use layoffs as a first resort simply because it's a known, socially accepted playbook in the business world. But the research highlights organizations that took a fundamentally different route. Look at how Accenture handled the massive 2008-2009 global recession. They didn't immediately slash their workforce to save cash. Instead, they implemented a system of graduated salary reductions.
Meaning the pain was shared across the company, but proportionally based on who could handle it, right?
Precisely how they structured it. The top executives took a 20% pay cut, while frontline employees took only a 5% cut. They instituted mandatory unpaid leave and offered voluntary separation packages for anyone who wanted to leave on their own terms.
And it worked.
It did. Because they exhaustively pursued every single creative alternative before forcing people out the door, they maintained their employee engagement. Furthermore, they actually attracted much better talent from their competitors after the recession ended, because they had preserved their organizational capability and their reputation.
It really comes down to values alignment. The outdoor apparel company Patagonia operates similarly. They willingly accept higher labor costs to align with their core values of protecting their community. When they need to manage financial changes, they do it slowly through natural attrition, like just waiting for people to retire or move on, rather than delivering sudden, violent shocks to the system. So what does this all mean? It means an organization's true culture isn't the inspirational quote painted on the lobby wall, it's how they treat people when the money gets tight.
This raises an important question about systemic resilience. Are modern companies entirely addicted to the short-term sugar rush of cutting headcount?
It seems like they are.
Right, because doing the hard work of strategic workforce planning, building flexible systems, cross-training employees so they can move between departments, and saving cash reserves for a rainy day that takes significant time and discipline. A sudden layoff gives an instant, albeit temporary, bump to the quarterly balance sheet. But as the data shows, it sacrifices the long-term health and innovative capacity of the organization.
And part of ensuring that long-term health requires redefining the psychological contract between workers and companies altogether. We have to move away from a promise of job security, which, let's be honest, no longer exists in the modern economy, to a promise of employability.
That is a crucial modern shift in the workplace. An organization can honestly say, we cannot guarantee you a job here for life, but we promise to invest in your skills so heavily and train you so well that whenever you do eventually leave, you will be highly marketable anywhere else.
It's just a much more honest, transparent contract.
It is. And it maintains high engagement because the employee feels the company is actively investing in their future, regardless of where that future unfolds.
So to pull all of this together for everyone listening, euphemisms like reduction in force and optimizing the talent footprint exist to comfort the leaders making the cuts, not the employees receiving them. And they inevitably backfire. They erode trust, destroy productivity, kill innovation, and exact a devastating physical and psychological toll on human beings. The brave alternative is authenticity. It's prioritizing procedural justice, offering comprehensive transition support, and exhausting every single creative alternative like shared proportional pay cuts before you take away someone's livelihood.
It requires a fundamental shift in perspective. Leaders must move from viewing employees as variable, expendable costs on a spreadsheet to viewing them as the actual, irreplaceable engine of the organization. When you protect the engine, the organization survives the storm.
Which brings us back to that fluorescent lit room, listening to the jargon. We've talked a lot today about the employer's responsibility to do better, but I want to leave you with a thought about your own position in all of this. If the modern employment contract is no longer based on long-term security, but merely on building temporary employability, does that fundamentally change how you should view your own loyalty?
That's a great question.
Right. If your employer is technically just a temporary client of your skills, how does that change the way you invest your emotional energy at work tomorrow?
It is a profound question every professional needs to ask themselves in today's landscape.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the hidden costs of corporate restructuring. Keep your eyes open and keep questioning the words being used around you. We'll catch you next time.